Christ is risen. And peace be with you. Today is the 7th Sunday of Easter. Technically, it is not the day that we celebrate the ascension of Jesus, but in many churches that don't have a habit or a rhythm of worshiping on feast days like that in the middle of the week, it usually gets moved to the next closest Sunday. So Ascension Day was actually on Thursday. And the reason that we mark the ascension of Jesus with a special day is really for two reasons. It's an event in the life of Jesus that carries the same kind of weight and importance as his birth, his death, his resurrection. And the reason that we understand this event to carry those same kinds of implications of importance is because so much of our doctrine is dependent on Jesus having ascended to return to the Father. So ascension, the ascension of Jesus, is both an event in Jesus' life, and it implies a lot of doctrine. That might be surprising to you. We don't often talk about the ascension of Jesus and its doctrinal implications, but it has many, and we're going to talk through a few of them today, and then actually coming to the table is heavily and deeply tied up in what it means that for Jesus to have ascended to the Father. So we're going to talk through those things, and then we're actually going to live some of those realities as well this morning. So the event of the ascension, which we heard from two different passages this morning, one from Acts and one from Luke, it's an event in the life of Jesus. It takes place 40 days after Easter, 40 days after Jesus is raised from the dead, and then 10 days before Pentecost, which is the pouring out of the Holy Spirit. And when you think about the order of events in the life of Jesus, you have his birth, his ministry, which includes his teachings, his miracles, his confrontations with the religious leaders, his interactions with especially people who live on the margins of society. We think about people like the Samaritan woman at the well, that encounter from which our church's name comes. You think about the healing of the woman with the issue of blood. You think about the way that Jesus moved towards even Gentiles to heal them. The man who was afflicted by many demons, many unclean spirits in the region of the Gerasenes. You think about the Syrophoenician woman who asked Jesus to heal her daughter. You think about the centurion who asks for his servant to be healed. You think about the unnamed woman who sometimes gets conflated with Mary Magdalene, who comes and anoints Jesus' feet with expensive perfume and then wipes his feet with her hair, anointing him before his death. I think that's the most spirited I've seen her on a Sunday morning. Welcome, Adrienne. We're glad you're here. All of these parts of Jesus' ministry are important. They're necessary. They help us to see clearly who God is and what God is like. You have Jesus' death on the cross, which is in many ways kind of this magnification point in his ministry. Jesus goes to the lowest depths of the human experience and submits not only to death, but to a particularly shameful death, a heinous death, a death that was used by the Romans, crucifixion, as a way of shaming their enemies, shaming those that they have subjected, making sure, that's why in Philippians 2, Paul says, and, being obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross, right? He has to make it really clear to us that this isn't just any kind of death. This isn't an accident. This isn't death from an illness. This isn't death from old age. That this is, I don't find these truths to be particularly controversial, but in some circles they are, but that it was a death at the hand of the state, that it was a death that brought shame. It was intended to bring shame on the whole community of people from which this person came. And so Jesus, he isn't just a sacrifice on the cross, but he enters into the most, sometimes people like to focus on like the pain inherent in crucifixion, and it was a particularly painful way to die, a slow and painful death. But it isn't even just like the intensification of agony that Jesus undergoes. What Jesus goes into is the depths of what it means to be alienated from God. He goes into that for us. That same space that we are subjected to by the power of sin and evil and death. Jesus goes into that place in order to rescue us from it. Jesus is then raised from the dead. That's his undoing of death. It's not just a reversal. It's turning it inside out and upside down. It is an undoing. That's why we understand Jesus' death and resurrection to be described by words like redemption. We're purchased back from that kind of slavery to sin and death. It's why we understand it through the metaphor of healing, right? If the greatest sickness that humans can go through is the sickness that's brought upon us by sin, which James tells us in his letter, when it grows into its fullness, is death. Jesus' death and resurrection is a kind of healing of that. His resurrection is followed by his presence with his disciples, his appearance to them, over 400 people, showing to them many proofs of not just being alive, but being raised from the dead. And after 40 days of that kind of presence in ministry, Jesus ascends. And having ascended back to the Father, returning to heaven, but returning, this is the complication of the incarnation, right? You have that which is mortal joined to that which is immortal, that which is changeable joined to that which is ineffable, that which is subject to decay joined to that which can never decay, right? Jesus ascends to the Father and he takes his human body with him. He's not a ghost. It's not a pseudo body. It's not a different body. Jesus takes the body with the scars, with the evidence of resurrection, of death and resurrection. And even as we believe that he's speaking to the Father on our behalf now, that he's interceding, that he's mediating, that he's an advocate for us, even if he used no words, our flesh there in the presence of the Father is enough to show the Father what it is that humans have gone through, that humans have done to themselves and to one another, to show the Father what it means. That just as in the first Adam all have died, in the second Adam all are given life. And because Jesus is there now, it makes sense that he would send his Spirit from that place and not before. The sending of the Spirit, which Jesus promises in these ascension passages, and which we know is coming a week from now. That reality that we live in and we're marking the anniversary of a week from now. It only makes sense for Jesus to send this Spirit of power, the Spirit of truth, the Spirit of reconciliation, once Jesus is fully in that work of reconciliation, bearing our flesh in the presence of God. These are the events of the ascension. This is what makes the ascension make sense in the order of Jesus' life. It's why it's imperative that we understand it. Part of this event is that Jesus is taken up into heaven, right? And it's funny to me the way that it often gets portrayed in Christian art. In a lot of more modern depictions, you kind of have Jesus like in the middle of the air, clouds surrounding him from above, beginning to envelop him, light shining forth behind Jesus, from Jesus. And it's almost as if he's sitting on an invisible throne as he's being raised into the air. And everyone below him kind of looking up as he ascends. In more medieval depictions of the ascension, Jesus is mostly already out of the picture and his feet are just sticking out from the cloud, right? And it's like, oh, where did Jesus go? Up. He went up. There are some really interesting depictions where even just the soles of Jesus' feet, right? Not that it's not ankle down, just the soles of his feet are visible from the cloud. And while the passage from Acts, has angels saying, "Men of Galilee, why do you look up into heaven?" Jesus, who was taken up into heaven, he'll return in the same way. We have to understand that heaven isn't directionally up, right? That these are word pictures that are used to help us understand something that is true, yes, in this way, but truer in other ways. Right? Heaven isn't directionally up as if it were somehow beyond wherever space ends, but it's ontologically up. It's a higher plane of reality, right? It's the place, heaven is really simply the place where God dwells. And as the place where God dwells, it's not like God is somehow apart from everything that God has made. Right? So heaven is the place where things already are the way that someday they will be everywhere. Does that make sense? Heaven is the place where things already are the way that they will someday be everywhere. Heaven is the place where God is. And so Jesus goes into that place. And this image here, I really wanted to be sure to show this one. Mike, I'm so sad that this is broken. This is my pointer that I use to talk about art when the art has something to teach us. I'm going to have to figure out how to fix this. But I wanted to be sure to show you this image in particular. This is really the first artistic depiction we have of the ascension of Jesus. We don't have any earlier depictions. And it's from a Syrian gospel book where the gospel was translated from Greek into Syriac. It's from the 6th century, the late 6th century. And what you can see are some of the things that you'll begin to see in all of the depictions of the ascension. You have the apostles gathered, you have Mary in the middle, you have the hints of Pentecost starting already with these tongues of fire starting to descend. But one of the things that you don't have is Jesus somehow hidden, right? Jesus is not hidden. He's clearly present, and it's not just his feet sticking up out of a cloud, nor is he somehow seated on an invisible throne. He's standing, and he has a scroll in his hand. You have angels attending to him. You've got the 4 living creatures from Ezekiel and from Revelation. But there are 2 things that I want to point out. You've got angels on the ground kind of ministering to the apostles. Here you have Peter, and opposite Peter you've got Paul. Now, if you've read your Gospels or the book of Acts closely, you know that Paul was not yet a Christian at the time when Jesus ascends. And so instead of depicting a historical truth, what you've got is a theological truth. The church in its fullness benefits from the ascension of Jesus. And the other thing that I want to point out is that even though Jesus is being raised up, even though Jesus is ascending into heaven, the thing that this image depicts most clearly, and the reason I wanted to be sure to use it and talk about it, is that the ascended Jesus is not somehow absent from the church on earth. When Jesus is like, his feet are just sticking out from a cloud, or in other medieval and Renaissance depictions, like there's a really clear division that's happening here, like in the space between heaven and earth. But this earliest depiction makes the truth that Jesus' absence in the body is not his absence from the church. And I think this is incredibly important to recognize. He takes his resurrection body with him into heaven. And even his resurrection body is a preview, a foretaste of how heaven is ontologically different, right? He walks through walls, he walks through locked doors, but he's not somehow less human or less real or less bodily. In fact, Jesus is more real in his resurrection than the world as we live in it. Not a ghost, but somehow more present to creation, that even locked doors and walls are not obstacles from him. It's not a different body, but it is the same body differently. It's the heavenly body, which is not separate from earth, but more present. The doctrine of the ascension brings some of these truths out and helps them to come to bear on our lives. When Jesus is ascended to the right hand of God, he's there in the beginning of his rule and his reign. He is sitting in session as our judge. As I've already said, he intercedes on our behalf with the Father. He's an advocate with the Father for us and a mediator. And in that same body, he now is eternally in the presence of God. But it does bring up this question, right, that Nathan talked about with the kids, about how we're usually sad when someone that we love leaves us. But here are the disciples, the apostles, rejoicing and worshiping. Jesus says in the Gospel of John, it's actually better for you that I go than that I stay. You see, when Jesus is here in his heaven, well, he says to Mary Magdalene after the resurrection in John's Gospel, do not cling to me, for I have not yet returned to my Father. And this brings up the question of absence and presence, right? Of course, the disciples in John's Gospel are sad at the idea of Jesus leaving when he says, where I am going, you cannot yet come. It's confusing, it's confounding, it's upsetting, because they want to be with Jesus. Bye-bye. One of the perhaps the most crucial thing for us to understand about the ascension is that when Jesus was on earth, even after his resurrection, the limitations of humanity that he submitted himself to willingly, right? This is also part of what Paul talks about in Philippians 2, when he talks about how Jesus descended, when he humbled himself and he took on the appearance of a man, becoming a servant. God the Son willingly took on human limitation. And I don't know if you're anything like me and you double book yourself, you underestimate the length of time it's going to take for you to complete tasks or projects, and then you find yourself needing to be in more than one place at one time. You perhaps have also experienced the impossibility of that. To be human is to be limited, to only being present in one place at one time. And this is true of the incarnate Jesus, even after his resurrection. But taking his body into heaven means now that even though Jesus is absent from one place, he's now present to every place. He's present in every place. By taking back up those attributes of the Godhead that he had laid down in the incarnation, Jesus now, in the same way that God the Father is capable of being present to and with and in every place all at once, Jesus is capable of doing the same thing. In fact, it's what makes it possible for each congregation in every place throughout all of history having confidence that when they celebrate Holy Communion, that Jesus is present with them. If Jesus was still limited in the ways that humans are limited to one place at one time, there would have to be one church in one place where we could go and receive communion and be confident that Jesus is with us. But having taken up again those qualities of what it means to be God and being in heaven, which is not somewhere else, but which is where God is and where things are now, the way that one day they will be everywhere, Jesus is capable of being present to his people in every place at all times. And we see the way that he fills everything. It is true that nobody is as distracted by your kids as you are, but when it's my kid, it sometimes comes to bear on all of us in my distraction. In Ephesians, when Paul is talking about Jesus ascending back to the Father in order to fill all of what God has made with his presence, this is what we're trying to get at. This fact that now that Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father, that he's begun his rule and his reign, that he sits in session as our judge, he's also capable of being intimately present in every place. Throughout Eastertide, we've been focusing on the peace of Jesus. And that first Sunday after Easter Sunday, we read that gospel passage in John where Jesus blesses his disciples as they're gathered in the upper room, hiding from the authorities. Jesus, having walked through locked doors, blesses them, saying, "Peace be with you." Twice, that first time, and then again when Thomas is with them 8 days later. It strikes me that here, just as he departs in Luke's gospel, that Jesus lifts up his hands and he blesses his disciples. That what he leaves them with is a blessing. And though we're not told what that blessing is, knowing who Jesus is, that he's Jewish, it's likely safe to assume that he's blessing them with that quintessential Jewish blessing of shalom, peace. He's praying wholeness over them, praying God's provision over them, that they would have everything that they need to flourish in the mission that Jesus is sending them on. Jesus can bless them with that peace because though he is absent from the one place that he's been limited to, now being in every place, everywhere that they go, Jesus will be with them, continuing to provide that peace to them because he is their peace. Samuel Wells, who is an Anglican priest and theologian, talks about the ministry of Jesus being able to be summed up with just two words: being with. The ministry of Jesus is about being with. Jesus is present to his people, regardless of their circumstances, even regardless of their sins. Jesus is with his people. Trying to elaborate on this point, he reverses those familiar words of the Westminster Catechism, saying that though the chief end of people is to be with God and enjoy him forever, the chief end of Christ's ministry is to be with people so that God enjoys us forever. The peace that Jesus offers is both inner peace and outer peace. He can help give us a sense of assurance that anxiety does not have to be what's most determinative about our lives. That worry and conflict do not get to have the last word about who we are and how we show up in our relationships, in our neighborhoods, to our jobs, at our church. And he also promises outer peace. Yes, the interruption of conflict, but also, oh, Maeve, don't pour water on her. We got to get her one of those buckets and sprinklers so she just bless people with holy water all through service. All right, I'm going to try to wrap this up. One of the questions that continues to, and I want to do just a little bit of, I don't want to get too far into the weeds because I really do want to wrap this up and move us into communion, because I think that, I believe in my deepest parts of me that that's what we really need. You don't really need to hear me talk anymore. But Holy Communion, its observance, its celebration, its reception, is one of those questions that continues to divide the church. within Protestantism and between Protestantism and Catholicism and even Orthodoxy. The question of what's happening here is a question that not all Christians agree on, and even within the life of our own church here, it's not something that we require agreement on. Lots of questions about, is it only a sign, a symbol? Or is it also a sacrament? That is to say, not just something that we remember, but something which makes the reality that it points to present in this moment. A theological mentor of mine was asked to write about communion with many other scholars from lots of other traditions for Christianity Today, about the various perspectives that continue to hold us as Protestants in an interesting tension with one another. And I found something that he said really helpful, right? Because the focus of the question is often like, what's happening with the bread and the cup, right? Is it a token, a symbol, a sign? Is it changed? Is Jesus present with it? Does it become Jesus' body and blood? Is it a spiritual reality, a physical reality? And this mentor of mine, Chris Green, he changed the question a little bit. He said, instead of focusing on the how question of Jesus' presence, maybe we ought to understand the question as who. Not how is Jesus present, but who is present here? And the answer is the risen Christ. And why is the risen Christ present here? He's present here to feed us, to heal us, and to transform us. And he goes on to quote a hymn of Charles Wesley. Receiving the bread, on Jesus we feed. It doth not appear his manner of working, but Jesus is here. When we come to the table, when we celebrate communion, when we receive the bread and the cup, the how of his showing up isn't explained. But the who of who is present is absolutely clear. Jesus is here, and he gives us himself. And he's here to give us himself in the peace of his presence. So let us move deeper into his presence this morning and receive the peace that he's offering us. Let's pray together.